Hi, everybody, and welcome to the first ever virtual Web Components SF Meetup. I'm Gray Norton. I'm the engineering manager for the Polymer Project at Google, and I'll be your host for today. We're super excited to have you here, and we've got some great talks in store for you. So in case this is your first time being exposed to us, we are a local San Francisco Bay Area meetup group, and we've had two events so far, one last September and then one in February, which you're seeing here. And we normally have a nice physical space like this, and we get to see people in person. And we're sad that we're not going to be able to see all of you here, but we're glad that there's a way to connect and talk about web components in any case. So we're going to have a Q&A at the end, which is sort of the interactive section, and we'll be taking questions from the audience. You'll be able to just ask questions in the YouTube live stream chat, and we will put them up on screen and we'll have a panel to answer them. But between now and then, we have a good program for you. And I just have a few introductory notes to kick us off. So even though there's not going to be a whole lot of live interaction, I do want to point out that everything that our meetup does is governed by a code of conduct, which you can see here. And it basically boils down to be nice to each other and respect each other's differences. We want to be inclusive and respectful of everybody. And at this point, if this were live, I would actually be giving you instructions for how to get down the hall to the bathroom. I'm going to trust that you all know how to find the bathroom from wherever you're watching. So in our last meetup, one of the speakers was Ben Farrell from Adobe, and he gave a really interesting talk called Web Components in Space. And actually, it was about some really clever uses of web components in virtual reality and augmented reality. But I'm bringing up this slide now because, as it happens, there was some recent news in which web components really did end up in space. So I'm not sure how many of you caught this, but the fancy touchscreen interface in SpaceX's manned Dragon craft was actually built using web technology. It runs in Chromium, and it's just ordinary HTML, JavaScript, and CSS. And as it happens, they chose web components. And I know that team was very interested in staying close to the platform and having as few dependencies as possible. And they were really able to take advantage of the built-in component model that web components provided to build a very sophisticated application without bringing along a heavy stack of userland code. So it was exciting news for web components. Now, as it happens, most uses of web components are a little more garden variety than that. So of course, they're great for embeddable widgets that you can put on any site. They're great for design systems. You can build a whole application out of them as well. I know one of our speakers today has done just that. But an increasingly common use of web components is actually to take a site that is either statically generated or server rendered and use web components to progressively enhance, if you will, and provide interactivity and rich functionality on top of a site. And that's certainly the case for GitHub. And so our first speaker, Kristján Oddsson, is going to tell you how GitHub takes advantage of web components. He will then be followed by Westbrook Johnson, who works at Adobe and is also part of the OpenWC group that has provided the web components community with a lot of great tools and advice. And he's going to be talking about using web components in the real world. There's been a lot of excitement over the years as web components landed, but Westbrook has been using them for real world projects for quite a while, and he has some really interesting and valuable patterns to point out that solve real world problems. And then after Westbrook wraps up, we'll go ahead and do that Q&A panel discussion that I was talking about, and we'll take your questions via the YouTube chat. So without further ado, I am going to get our first speaker, Kristján Oddsson, up on screen. Hi, Kristján.
Hey, how's it going?
Going well. You ready?
Yeah, let's do this.
All right, let's do it.
Cool. So welcome to my talk, how we use web components to build GitHub.com. And thank you for having me. I'm excited about this topic, and I hope you are as well. My name is Kristján Oddsson, like we said before. I'm from Iceland, but I currently live in the UK, and I really enjoy hiking. This is a picture of me in Hotstrandir in Iceland last July. If you ever want to go there, it's very beautiful. Like we said, I work at GitHub. I've been an engineer there for the past 3 years. I make up 1/4 of the web systems team, and the rest of the people on the team are David, Moan, and Keith. And we're essentially like the JavaScript and web technologies team. Now, I wanted to talk about 3 things today in my talk. I'm going to talk about how front-end behaviors, we call them behaviors, are structured in the GitHub.com code base, how we write custom elements at GitHub, and I'll look at a demo of a custom element that we have at GitHub.com, and then some things that we're excited about in the future. So if we'll start with behaviors, a lot of our JavaScript is structured into behaviors, and this is like a term we give to these little code components. You can think of these as components. We scope them to HTML elements using CSS classing naming schemes, and we've done this for a very long time. But in the last few years, we've been taking these contained behaviors and we've been converting them to web components. Now, I'm going to have a fair bit of code in this talk. So I have this slide where I warn people that there's going to be a lot of code, and you don't need to read all of it at once, because we're going to just step through the bits together, and I'll highlight it. So don't feel the need to read everything on the slide at once. So here's a typical behavior. We have on the top here, we have the JavaScript, and at the bottom we have the HTML. And together it makes this behavior. And if we'll walk through each part of it, we have a button and we have an on-click handler for the button. And you'll see that in order to get a reference to this button, we need to call the current target property on the event, and then we have a reference to the button. And then in order to get the container of this behavior, we need to traverse up the tree from the button, get the container, and then we have this encapsulating container element. And then finally, we can query that container for the input and output elements, and we can run the functionality that we want to do. Like this is a hello world behavior. So once an input, once the button is clicked, the output is set to hello, comma, whatever the input was at the time. So if you type in like Kristján, hit the button, it will say hello Kristján. So it's very simple, but there's like a lot of code to do this one simple behavior. And it isn't particularly bad. Like we have a ton of these behaviors. That's how we run a lot of GitHub.com, and this has served us really well. But there are a few drawbacks. One is that CSS naming scheme I mentioned earlier. This requires a fair bit of linting tests, and this it also requires some amount of self-disciplines from engineers in order to be effective. And I've highlighted like the CSS naming scheme for this one behavior here, and it consists of like the container CSS class, and then you have all the elements within that, like all the references to the button, the input, and the output. And you can see how the JavaScript and HTML here are linked together. A second drawback is it's a bit awkward when you're trying to, like, we really just want to get the input and output, but in order to do that, we need to figure out what button was clicked, find its containing element, and then get the input and output from that container. It would be a lot easier if I could just in the HTML just say, I think React has something like where you just have a reference, and then within the behavior, you can just have that reference already because the library did all that for you. So that's another drawback. And finally, there's bit of a problem with scope because these are just like CSS classes. There's nothing stopping any engineer from just adding on more functionality and like overloading a class with multiple responsibilities. And that's maybe fine in the beginning, but that kind of adds up and it becomes kind of large and unwieldy and hard to refactor. So to sum that up, our behaviors that require a naming scheme, creating them can be really awkward and they're poorly scoped. So what we've been doing is we've been taking behaviors and we've been converting them to custom elements where it makes sense. And let's take a look at some of the custom elements. Let me tell you first off, we at GitHub, we open source a lot of our custom elements. If you go to git.io/custom elements, you'll be redirected to this page where I think it's like 17 of our open source elements are now, and we keep adding more. This is just a link to a GitHub search for the GitHub org and anything that has the custom elements topic on it. So it should list all of them, and you can pick those apart and see what you like about them. We like to think of our custom elements as progressive enhancements. For us, this means that we won't generate any of the initial HTML for you, and we won't supply you with any of the CSS. These are just like non-branded HTML elements that we kind of try to align as closely as we can with built-in elements. So we try to take a lot of inspirations on how these work and how they behave from built-in elements. We don't use the shadow DOM. When we were looking at it, the browser support wasn't really good. It might have changed now, but at the time it didn't really work for us, and we really haven't found a good problem that the shadow DOM would solve in our case. So we don't use it. And then we don't have any branding on them. These are just called kind of what you would call the elements. Like we call them tab container because it's a tab container. We call them like auto check. There's no like GitHub auto check or GitHub tab container or GitHub button or whatever. My coworker Keith, I think, said it best when he said, the biggest compliment we can receive about our components is if somebody doesn't realize that our custom element isn't just a built-in element. Like they'll be writing HTML and they're like, why doesn't this element, why doesn't it work? And they don't realize they have to like add this JavaScript for it to work. Like that's kind of describes our thought process. So if we'll take a look at one element that we have, it's auto check. And I wanted to talk about auto check. It's an input element that validates its value against the server endpoint. So it's like you type in a username and the server will tell you if this username is valid or not. And I wanted to talk about it because if you've ever created a repository on GitHub, you've used auto check. This is how it would look to you. You would type in your repository name here. I have a little GIF, if it plays, yes. You would type in your repository name, and it'll be like, you already have one that's called JSON resume. So you type until you get it green, and it tells you can create this repository. And this is a custom element. It doesn't have a lot of responsibilities. It just asks the server, is this a valid value for this endpoint? And let's just walk through the code a little bit. Here's another code example warning that I'm gonna talk a lot about code all of a sudden. So this is one half of the functions that we have in AutoCheck. I've grouped these together because if you've ever worked with custom elements, these might look familiar. These are like the lifecycle elements. You have the connected and disconnected callback. These are called whenever the element gets inserted or removed from the DOM. You have an attribute changed callback and an observed attributes. And these work in tandem where the attribute change callback is called whenever an attribute that's listed in the observed attributes array gets changed. So you have to list it in the observed attributes, and then you get the callback that this attribute was changed. So if you've ever used, the word escapes me now. If you've ever used object-oriented programming, you'll notice we don't have a constructor here. You can have a constructor, We just don't use it because we feel like connected callback serves most of our needs. If you use a constructor, it's the element. It doesn't mean that the element is connected to the DOM, and so we prefer to just use the connected callback and these lifecycle methods. The second part of AutoCheck element are these getters. These map pretty much one-to-one to the attributes of the element, except for this first one, which just gets the HTML input element from the DOM. Otherwise, these just map to the attributes. And so if you look at all this together, now that I've kind of explained both parts, you'll notice that we don't have a JavaScript API. There's no like check the input or check function that you can call. Like the way, if you wanted to set this manually in JavaScript, is you would set the value of the input, and these lifecycle methods would just do its work. It would just change the attributes, and the lifecycles should just do what they do. And this is what I was trying to say earlier, where we want to try to align ourselves with how built-in elements work. And this is how built-in elements work. And so this is kind of how we do it. If we take a closer look at the input getter here, I wanted to show this one. It's because it's very simple and it fits on a slide, but also because now that querying is a little bit better, querying for elements within the component or within the behavior, you can see how boilerplatey this is. Like, if I could just say in the HTML, like, this is the input, like, give the reference, this is the input, and then this should be done by a machine. Like, the computer should be able to do this for me, but right now I have to write this boilerplate just to get the input. Whereas if I could just do it and write it in the HTML, I could just get the reference. So I just wanted to mention that as a drawback. Another drawback is also boilerplate. We'll step through this too. I know it's a lot of code. I didn't have my code warning slide here, but this registers the custom element. Like, that's everything it does. And if we'll walk through it, like this bit here specifically registers the element to the custom elements registry. There's a check to see if AutoCheck is already defined, the tag name AutoCheck. And if it isn't, we'll register it. And then we add the AutoCheck element to the global scope. And then this bit is just letting TypeScript know of AutoCheck, that, you know, there's AutoCheck element in the global scope, and there's a tag name AutoCheck that has the type AutoCheck element. And so we do this for all our components because we use TypeScript, and then, you know, there's the bit about adding it to the global scope and registering it. And it's not a big deal. I mean, you can copy and paste this, but this is another piece of boilerplate that would be good to get rid of. I wanted to also just show you that we try to keep our elements pretty slim. AutoCheck element only has one dependency, and that's a dependency from us that we wrote ourselves. Which means that AutoCheck is 1.3 kilobytes, and it's going to take you 26 milliseconds on emerging 3G to download, which is pretty good, I think, at least. You can go to git.io/AutoCheck, and you'll be redirected to the repository. This is open source. You can check it out yourself. Check out the examples and issues and pull requests and take a look and see what you think. So this is the slide from before, the behavior slide, but I'm going to cross out the things that I think are not valid anymore because we're using custom elements. And we definitely don't need a naming scheme anymore. But is querying still awkward? I think it can still be awkward when you're using custom elements. Like I showed before, there's boilerplate that we could just get rid of. Are they poorly scoped, like how behaviors are poorly scoped? I'd argue no. But as we've kind of like solved some of these issues, I feel like another issue has shown its head, which is now that we require boilerplate. So there's still some drawbacks that I think maybe we can do better. So that's how kind of custom elements solve the issues that we had with behaviors. but there's also still drawbacks. There's still stuff maybe we can do better. So if we'll go into the future and what we think of are kind of like the next steps for us at GitHub on how to solve some of these drawbacks of custom elements, we have written this. I hesitate to call it a library. It's just like a very small kind of collection of code, I guess. We call it Catalyst, and it's fairly simple. It's just a collection of technologies that we like and use, and we've collected them in such a way that it solves some of these issues. It's basically just custom elements. Then we have TypeScript, because TypeScript brings us decorator support, which isn't supported by the platform currently, as far as I know. And then we just wrote some helper decorators. And there's 3 of them specifically. And I'll show you examples of that. We'll go through this hello world example that we had in the beginning, but written how it would be written if you had Catalyst. So this is the whole code, and we're just going to step through all of it. First of all, you have the hello world tag. And you'll notice here, I don't have that boilerplate that I had before. I just have this controller decorator. Otherwise, we just have like this hello world element, and it just extends element. And what the controller decorator is doing, it's taking the class name hello world element, it's taking that element bit off the back, lowercasing it, and dasherizing it. So it just creates that tag name for you and registers the custom element under that name. And it also does that TypeScript boilerplate that I showed before. The next bit is we have references to elements. We call them targets. You have a input target here and an output target. In the HTML, this is just set by setting a data target attribute with the string hello world.input, which is just the component name and then the reference. And then, of course, hello world output for the output. And on the component side, we again just have these decorators, target decorators in front of these class fields, input and output. And then what this does behind the scenes is we create this getter for you on the element, on the custom element, that when you call it, it just queries the element by that data target attribute. So it's kind of just like that same boilerplate that I showed you before in the custom element where we're getting the input. It just does that for you with this target decorator. And then finally, we have event binding. I don't think I talked about it at all, but this is pretty useful. Like, you don't have to set up event listeners yourself. You just have an action. So data action attribute, it has a string. It comes in 3 parts. It's the event name, then a colon, the component name, hash, function name. So this can be read as when a click event is dispatched on this element, we go into the hello world custom element and we call the function greet, which you can see here is available on the element. So that's pretty much all there is. Like, this is fairly simple. It kind of solves like the biggest issues we have with custom elements, which I listed up earlier. And so if we go through this now, I think querying is not as awkward as it was. And we can strike that out. And we've gotten rid of this boilerplate. Catalyst is very simple. It's not very complicated. We wrote it because it solves an issue for us. We're heavily inspired by this framework called Stimulus. I think it's made by Basecamp. And if you look at the example here, you can see like the glaring similarities. We basically saw Stimulus, wanted to use it, but we're kind of invested in custom elements already. And so we were like, what would Stimulus look like if you had custom elements? And this is not a new idea. There's a lit element. If you've ever used that, you can see the similarities again. It does other stuff, like it does rendering. It does this other stuff that we haven't seen the need for us yet. So that's kind of why we built our own thing. And there's Microsoft came out with this new thing the other day called Fast Design. One part of that is Fast Element. And again, you can see the kind of similarities. A lot of people are kind of like looking at this problem space and solving it for them or other people, the community as a whole. So if you have these kind of similar problems, I'd look at, Fast Element or Lit Element, or make your own like we did. It can be simple, or you can take one from the shelf, or you can do whatever. And that was basically how we're doing it. And basically my whole talk. I hope I didn't speak too fast. Thank you for having me again. I'm not on Twitter, so you can't follow me there, but you can email me at hi@cosmic.com. And yes, thank you so much.
Thank you, Kristján. That was awesome. And as soon as you hop off, there'll be lots of nice comments for you to look at in the YouTube stream. It's clear that everybody enjoyed your presentation a lot. So with that in mind, we'll see you shortly for the Q&A. And let's bring Westbrook on stage. Welcome, Westbrook. Are you set?
Great. Yeah, I'm all set.
All right, let's get your slides up, and I will disappear into the background.
Thanks. Good afternoon, good evening, good morning. Everyone is not in the same location anymore, so it's very hard to talk about time, but I am very excited to be here with everyone today. My name, again, is Westbrook Johnson, and I work with the digital imaging team at Adobe, where a couple of projects that I'm a part of is the Spectrum Web Components project, bringing Adobe's design system to the web with via web components. I also work, as Gray mentioned, with the Open Web Component Recommendations team, bringing some great tooling and recommendations and configurations for developing with web components to the community. And if you are a Twitter fan or a Dev2 user, you might have heard about a new endeavor from that team called Modern Web that we just announced this morning. And definitely take a chance to check that out. Some great new test tooling and dev server options, as well as a brand new website with recommendations and learning around working with modern web development. So through those things, there was already a lot of subjects that I could have chosen to bring to the conversation today. Particularly Spectrum Web Components is still pretty new. However, not only did Ben Forel, my colleague at Adobe, preclude and ruin the web components and space mood for SpaceX, he also did a really great job of introducing some of the things that you can do with Spectrum Web Components as a part of his talk. So I highly suggest that you check that out. Similarly, Open Web Components has a lot of great tools that I use every day, and you might want to as well. In fact, between the two of those, I built my presentation today in webcomponents.dev. If you've not checked it out, it's a really great way for you to start sharing and collaborating on code in the cloud and getting your web components developed from zero. And I actually built the slides that we're going to be seeing today in webcomponents.dev, and under the covers, webcomponents.dev uses a lot of the tools from Open Web Components, so it's like a nice circle spinning back around. And so I wanted to get a chance to show you that we are in that context, but I will present at full screen so we can see that, see the slides a little bit better. And if you are following along at home, this bit.ly link will link you to this slide deck, so you can check out how I put it together and follow along if you're interested. People that are into that sort of thing, I just this week found out that Chrome Canary will allow you to create QR codes for web URLs, so you could get there even faster. I mean, bit.ly is so fast, but get there even faster if you've got your QR scanner on your phone. go ahead and follow along if you'd like, or check out the presentation after today's meetup. So I really want to thank Web Components SF for having me. And really, we're Web Components World. I mean, it's great to see Kristján's talk about the work that he's doing in London, and I am based in New York. And so we're really cool to see an even broader community coming together in support of this meetup group. And I'm really glad that you're here, wherever your home is, and really continue to expand that community as well. So when I first heard about Web Components SF, I was really excited to get the chance to talk. And I was really glad that the team contacted me about being a part of this event. And I thought, what should I speak about? And I thought about some talks that I really love. You know, whether you go back to the introduction to Web Components by Alex Russell, or the introduction to CSS custom properties and apply for customizing Web Components by Monica. I will not pretend to be able to pronounce her last name. Or you go back to the introduction to Lit HTML by Justin Fagnani, and more recently, a really great conversation on the accessibility object model by Leonie Watson, are all really, really amazing talks that all touch kind of on this one thing, that they're kind of the new hotness, the next thing you'll be able to use. In fact, Alex Russell, in his talk, got into model-driven views that was so new and next generation that it never came to be. Luckily, a number of his other conversations now, 10 years later, did come to be, because I'm going to get to talk to you. We get to build in them every day. Web components are in every evergreen browser, and are a really great way to be developing both components as well as applications. And being able to customize those with custom properties was really great, and it was really cool to see that as the new hotness when Monica presented that. And again, you see a little bit of sort of add-apply part of that conversation didn't make it into the space, and it sort of starts to continue to maybe draw a trend here in the new hotness of Lit HTML. Brought the template instantiation spec that Safari is still interested in, so hopefully there's some future there. And you also see the accessibility object model is brand spanking new, and Leonie's presentation about it is really exciting. So we're going to cross our fingers for that. But I realized that maybe speaking about the new hotness is not the right call. I mean, that's not to say that there isn't a lot of new hotness. And before I talk about that for a second, let's spin back to what exactly is new hotness. And I'm realizing that I missed one of the most important talks, and that's actually a series of introductions to new jQuery features by Paul Irish, where I was actually introduced to the term new hotness. And it talks about recently, partially, or yet to be shipped features for whether you're talking about a browser or a framework or what have you. And it's the things to get excited about being able to do soon. Particularly for web components, we have a really long list of new hotnesses that can be a part of our work on a daily basis. And any one of these subjects could have been a great central theme for a talk today, but I thought a little bit about each one of them. But I realized that something else that's still kind of new hotness, if you take recently available, are the actual specifications of custom elements in Shadow DOM, and in their own way, ES modules and the template tag that actually make up web components as a whole. We've just, depending on your release channel, gotten support across the evergreen browsers as of the beginning of the summer. Yay, yay, Chromium Edge. Welcome to the family. And so I spent a little time thinking about, what is after the new hotness? What do you talk about when the new thing that you've been excited about so long for so long is actually the thing that you can use on a daily basis. And I got to thinking, well, that's just actually doing the work, right? Like actually going to the office in the morning and writing code. And really what we're doing when that happens is we are raising the valleys to meet the peaks. We've seen for years these really great presentations of what will be possible and all of the amazing things that we'll be able to build. And it's time to make everything that we build a little bit more amazing than it was before. And taking that into account, I wanted to think about things that we can do today to make our applications, whether they're built with web components or not, a little bit better. And so I came upon this list of ideas that I wanted to think about. You know, being able to extend on techniques that already exist, whether that's CSS and JS or JavaScript mixins or testing with Puppeteer, some things about working through the realities of being on the web, whether that's accessibility or managing events, whether they're composed or not, as well as ways that maybe we could learn from techniques that are already available, whether those are things like React hooks or static site rendering and generation, and bring them into sort of the everyday of what we might be able to do with web components. And so thinking about things that we can extend on, this is a list of things that I've thought about, and it's by no means extensive, but it's still really long. So I'm gonna focus down, and I'm gonna get us focusing primarily and extend on the DOM testing library. And I don't know if anyone has worked with the DOM testing library, but it's a really cool project that allows you, through use of their special querying syntax, querying methods in a testing environment, to, instead of try to use testing IDs, which strangely enough, I randomly got asked about this morning. I have never been on a team that actually used them, and I didn't realize it was something that you needed to overcome in some cases. But if you're ever asked about testing ideas, it might be DOM testing library might be something that you're interested in, and that it pivots the testing process away from this sort of synthetic representation of your work, and actually will query by label text elements in your code. And so you can use this raw HTML string that we've imported here that has a form that's like the most useful form ever because it's just an input. But in this example, we're able to leverage the get by label text to point directly to that input, and it'll exist. And that's super great if you're working with completely vanilla DOM, where you can see all of that. However, if you're working with web components and maybe you're not GitHub and you have the possibilities that come from working with Shadow DOM, you might run into the reality that by default, that's not possible. And so were our HTML string actually some sort of custom element with a form inside of its shadow root, by default, the DOM testing library's query helpers will not see through the shadow boundary, and the input element that we were searching before will fail out our test as not having existed. So in the theme of extending on, because I believe this is a really great tool to be able to leverage in testing, in the theme of extending on, I've recently released a very early beta tool that takes the DOM testing library and shims their querying language to allow permeation through the shadow DOM, so that you could leverage the really great tools that they have. And querying by label text is by no means the depth and breadth of the capabilities that DOM testing library would offer, but it brings that into the world of web components, so that when you use these techniques and approaches to unit test Shadow DOM, you would also be able to benefit from this sort of library. As I said, it's a really early beta, and I'm not sure I can say that enough. But if you check it out on NPM and get into it and it's something that you're interested, I think it's something that as a community, whether it's going back to working with the Open Web Components team or possibly even with the modern web extensions there, finding a better place for this to live and making it more useful for the community at large is something I'm excited about making possible in the future. From there, thinking, going back to my list on things that we need to work through. And a lot of people might say, oh, you wouldn't have to work through this if you had web component, if you didn't have web components. And I think that's inherently wrong. Accessibility is a really important thing for us to think about, regardless of what sort of framework or technologies we're using to deliver our applications. And managing things like DOM events and understanding where they've come from and where they'll go to is really important, regardless of the technologies that you use. But for today's talk, I'm going to primarily focus on leveraging custom styling for the dir attribute, which manages whether the direction of the content in our page. Particularly, if you're managing directional content, you might be working with a language like Hebrew. Here in Hebrew, Benny Powers outlines his love for web components. And you'll see in the English translation, the use of the dir attribute allows the text to be left to right directional. And with the use of the RTL value of the dir attribute, Benny's Hebrew is able to be displayed in that direction. So support for this style of content is something that we've recently been working on in Spectrum Web Components. And you start to run into some specifics around being able to support this content in web components that maybe you wouldn't were you to be leveraging non-shadow DOM. In particular, when you're working with the dir attribute, you might generally be able to style right to left content with a CSS selector like this. With no shadow boundaries, you could be hanging that direction attribute on your document and it would hit all of your content. However, once you apply a shadow boundary, you're going to realize that that doesn't work. You're not able to see from your document element through to children of that shadow DOM. And so you might think, oh, well, I'll just use this really great dir pseudo selector, which is going to be a really great addition to browsers across the ecosystem in the future. Today, this selector is only available for styling shadow DOM in Firefox, but hopefully browsers are going to be prioritizing getting this available to us across the ecosystem soon. But that means that we have even more work to think about today. And so one other option that we have for styling directional content is the host context pseudo selector. And this is a really interesting technique that allows you to essentially query up from your elements and say, does something above my shadow DOM have the dir attribute? And if it does, I'd like to style from that value. And it's also really powerful. However, it's currently only available in Chrome. And as the spec process stands to the best of my knowledge today, other browsers will not be adding this selector to their feature list. So there's still some work that we need to think about. And in cases where these two selectors aren't available, that means we need to be manually hanging a dir attribute off of whether it's our host or a wrapper element inside of our content somewhere that will be accessible to our shadow DOM. And this creates some interesting issues, because how do you write a dir attribute on what could, in a rather web component rich application, be almost every one of your components? Liz from the Material and Polymer team shared this code sample of what they're looking at doing to make that possible recently. And I apologize, Liz, this isn't exactly her code sample. She shared a JS bin, which doesn't play well with my presentation software. However, it's a pretty straight copy, and just want to make sure that that attribution is given, not stealing anyone's code. It's important that we understand who's creating work. And what she's done is she has leveraged the mutation observer pattern to be able to listen on the document element for changes of the dir attribute, and then propagate that down into a wrapper element. And so when you're toggling that attribute, you're able to get content throughout your application to realize that change. And that is a really powerful pattern if you assume that your page is always going to be a single direction of content, which in my experience is pretty true, but is something that we weren't ready to depend on in the context of spectral web components. So what we've actually done is extend our theming provider, this SP theme element, which traditionally would supply things like scale for the sizing of the content, as well as color for whether or not you hit one of our 4 lightest, dark, or darkest color themes, to include a direction attribute and actually register the contents of its contents with as listening to that element, so that you're able to get the right to left content attribute applied across all of the content in that scope for you to be able to realize that content direction without having to address each individual element in your HTML. So from there, I want to return to our learn from context, and there's really great efforts going around the community for static site rendering or static site generating. You might have noticed, if you were following some of the modern web announcements this morning, that the team there is using 11D, which is a really great static site generator, and there will definitely be some new hotness coming out in that area in the future. We've also heard a lot as a JavaScript community about React hooks and the things that brings to development. But once again, there's so many more things than this to focus on. And for today, I'm going to be talking about a really interesting technique that was recently announced called CSS custom property stacks. So I don't know if you follow CSS Tricks, or maybe you follow Miriam Suzanne, who has definitely the best CSS tricks that I've seen. But just last month, she published this article called "Using Custom Property Stacks to Tame the Cascade." And I think this is a really interesting technique for being able to leverage CSS custom properties, which I think it comes back really interesting to the talks that I really have loved and started thinking about in developing this presentation, in that there's actually a bit of a shared history, at least from my point of view, between CSS custom properties and custom elements, and that they definitely came up in a really similar time period. And so it's cool to see how, as their community starts to grow up, there might be things that we can learn from and be able to apply in our community. And so here, just a quick introduction to how CSS custom property stacks work. It's a really direct parallel to a pattern that you might know in your font family stacks. So for our font family declarations, we're able to give fallbacks on our font values. So in this case, Console S will fall back and fall back and fall back to monospace if nothing previously had been available. And similarly, via this syntax here that Miriam has shared, you're able to start with, if state is available, use that value for our background color. If not, fall back. If not, fall back. And if absolutely nothing else is available, use Deep Peek to decide what the background color is. And this is really interesting because not only does it allow a default color delivery, it also allows thematic color delivery at the application scale, as well as thematic application at the component scale, as well as managing some things around state, which I think is a really, really cool pattern. And definitely check out her article linked to in the previous slide when you're checking out the deck later to see more about what she was bringing to bear with this technique. And so I thought, well, what if we thought about stacked slots? And so just to touch a bit on that, I stacked some cats, because if you're not stacking cats, how can you stack slots, I guess? But taking a look at the generalized slot practice, you might be used to using something like this: a slot with a name header to gather header content, a default slot to maybe gather content or something else, and then a footer slot to be able to capture footer content. And in this case, you only have the three options of the two named slots and the default slot, and that's really all you have to work with. But in a stack slot content text, we would be able to leverage the fact that a slot is actually can be given default content in our Shadow DOM. So we could start with a fully custom slot at the very top of our component, but then be able to, and that would, if that was available, it would be all that showed. But then in the case that title is necessary, we could have that. And in the case that varying levels of content were available instead, we could have that. And it gives us a really interesting way to offer customization options to a second party user. And the different variants here kind of look like this. Here is a context of actually the controlled slides that I had built the slide deck that I'm presenting from today with. And this is using the most content-dense number of slots. So we have a title here, we have our content top, content start and end, our content bottom, and our content footer. And we're able to get this fully rich content slide. And I'll also point out, in a sort of throwback to our direction work, this layout is using the actual start and end context of grid and CSS grid and CSS flexbox that allow for this content to be immediately directional supported, which is why I use start and end here as opposed to left and right, because the start will actually become right in the RTL context. In another option, we could have just a single content in the middle. So here we're surfacing content middle. And what's interesting, and likely not to happen in context, but something I wanted to be able to point out is here I've positioned content to be displayed in our content start or content end slots. However, because they exist in the default content of our content middle slot, when there is actual content to slot into content middle, those slots are no longer available. And so even though they're present here, they're not slotted into our content, which gives you some interesting ability to be able to switch around between the content you're delivering from a single component. You take this deeper and you can have a single content element, and our slides here are getting less content rich as we go. And then at the very smallest level, we can have a single piece of content slotted into our custom slot. Here I also wanted to show again that elements without slots are not going to be positioned into the Shadow DOM. And content that would have previously been targeted for default slot content, because there is the overriding slot present, are not available any longer in our actual delivered template. So one thing that I thought as I was bringing these ideas together was how this is a like uniquely web components possibility. Even so much so that in the polyfills that we had sort of grown a little bit, maybe too accustomed to over the last number of years, would have made pretty difficult. In fact, were you to try to ship this in a polyfill context, you would have to be, you need to do a little bit of extra work around querying selector to see what slot was actually available and delivering a specific piece, a specific template based off of what slots were present, because the polyfills, much like you see in other frameworks, weren't built to support this sort of complexity around the slots feature. But what's really great now that we have web components and all of the specifications and APIs that make up this family of technologies available across browser is that you can start to see techniques and approaches like this come to life in ways that just aren't really repeatable in other constructs. And once again, just to round out the possibilities of a polyfill here, you would return again, I think, to the mutation observer pattern so that we saw a little bit before to understand when our child list changed. In this case, pointing into a lit element, trigger the request update when that DOM has updated. But this is only necessary if you're supporting these older browsers. And as the evergreen count moves forward, roughly 6 weeks at a time or 6 months at a time, there's going to be less and less of those browsers that we need to think of supporting, and hopefully more and more of these new and interesting techniques becoming possible in our everyday development. So with that, that's my talk. Once again, I'm Westbrook Johnson. There's some links here for following me on GitHub or Twitter, or if you're also a member of the Polymer Slack, which is a great place to follow up and ask questions, not only about the talks today, but is also about the work that's gone into open web components and the modern web project that just was released this morning, as well as any of my work at Adobe or the work that we do with Spectrum Web Components. I look forward to speaking with you and seeing what's after the new hotness for you.
Great, I think you're muted.
Indeed I am, and it was not my dishes for the record, but I did mute myself just in case. I muted everybody. I think the dishes might have been at Westbrook's house, but only he could say for sure. Okay, so let's go ahead and get Justin on the screen as well, and we can get Westbrook's slides off, and we can get Steve up here. And we're going to go ahead and take some questions now. So I've really been enjoying looking at all of the comments as they fly by. And now we'll use that same comment stream to go ahead and address any questions you may have to either of the speakers, or more generally, if you have questions or things that you'd like to see the panel discuss around web components, feel free to toss those in as well. While we're waiting for stuff to come up in the comments, does anyone who's been watching the talks have questions for any of the speakers? Can we have some intra-panel discussion?
Yeah, well, I really enjoyed both talks there. Kristján, one thing that came up when you compared Catalyst to Stimulus was I was thinking about how when they launched, when Basecamp launched Hey.com, how they mentioned they had this new unreleased version of Stimulus. And it seemed like that might be based around web components too, which is pretty exciting. So I don't know if you got a chance to look at any of that or dig in. I don't know anybody who has a Hey.com account yet myself, but
I have not heard anything about that personally, but I'd be super interested because when we saw Stimulus, it was right up our alley for what we're doing. Like, I think the tagline is, it's like JavaScript for the HTML you already have. We like to write a lot of like HTML and like, then there's like progressive enhancements on top of that. So it kind of fits the way we think about things. So I'd be super interested in seeing what they come up with over there.
Yeah, likewise, Alpine and Intercooler, there seems to be a lot of these HTML first things that could benefit from custom elements. So very interesting.
I have another question for you, Kristján. So first of all, I also really loved your talk, both talks actually, and I hope that you guys continue to evaluate the potential for using Shadow DOM in GitHub. I understand the reasons why you haven't so far. I think that in the future, with better browser support and things like declarative Shadow DOM, I think some of the use cases could potentially be even better. I actually just had a question. This is incredibly drilled in and maybe too detailed for this, but I'll try. So when you showed you did something fancy with TypeScript that I didn't know was possible, and I wanted to double check. Did you actually manage to make a decorator that like added the element to the HTML tag map and defined a global interface and all that? Because I think I tried that once and wasn't successful.
Yes.
Nice.
Yes, it's been a while since I looked at the actual code, but yes, I'm pretty sure it does that.
Nice.
Well, this is a great segue into the first audience question, which was, I think, yes.
Right. That like we like to open source as much as we can, but we also kind of like run things in production and like kick the tires on things and like figure out what we need before we open source it. So we haven't done so already. Like, we're in no rush, and it's mostly because we built this thing specifically for us. Like, we're not really thinking about like other people right now. Like, it's just for like our specific use case. But we do want to open source it. Yes, that is the plan. And it's kind of, like I said, it's mostly for like people to look at the code and like see, how we solve these problems and how they can take those lessons and maybe implement them in their own projects.
Thanks, Kristján. We have another question here. This one directed at Westbrook.
Yeah, Hubert. So it's definitely a thought/idea experiment. Like I said, I did use the stack slot technique for delivering my slides today. It came from some research we've been doing in Spectrum Web Components around our card component and how we are hoping to be able to surface like very like intricately laid out content while also being able to slot like much more general content into the component. And there are definitely some great options around component extension and customization in that realm, but looking at finding the right way to make the balance between user-centric customization and reuse while also reducing the overhead for development and the size, pointing back to Kristján's great point, the size of the components that you're shipping. These are things that we're taking into account as we make plans for that component.
I just want to interject one thing really quickly. It pained me greatly to see the polyfill code on those slides, and it is not at all surprising that Shady DOM polyfill doesn't support that currently. But I don't see fundamentally why we couldn't add support for it. So we're trying not to focus on adding things to the polyfill because we'd love to get rid of them. But if it's a really useful pattern, again, it's nice if it just works out of the box, obviously.
Yeah, we have a comment in the chat that somebody else, Emilio in the chat, did something very similar for card components and points out that it's very helpful for integrating with probably static HTML and CMSs, because your content author can declaratively choose exactly where and kind of what level of the stack to slot in the content. That seems very nice.
All right, we have another question for Kristján here.
Okay, so is GitHub still Rails? And if so, did Rails play with web components out of the box? GitHub is made, like the GitHub.com is made up of a multitude of technologies. It's mostly Rails. I think that's correct. Don't quote me on that. But yes, like it's mostly Rails, and what you end up with is you just deliver HTML to the client, and that plays extremely well with web components. Like you have web components in all modern browsers, and so it's just a matter of including some JavaScript and enriching that HTML. So I think Rails and web components are a really good match.
Here's a question that maybe Justin or Steve or both can field.
Yeah, so the question is, any updates on declarative shadow DOM? And yeah, I mean, Chrome actually has declarative shadow DOM shipping. I can't remember if it's an origin trial or behind a flag or both.
Both, I believe.
Both, yeah. So, there are some people who are trying this out, and there's definitely a lot of engagement from both Chrome and Apple and Firefox standards teams on this. There are definitely some tricky parts to figure out here. Whether or not we can have streaming support or not, how to deal with closed shadow roots properly, which kind of intersects with element internals and how this API works. So I think things are pretty positive on the broad strokes of the proposal. And it's kind of a question of getting feedback from testers and kind of nailing down these very specifics about these different cases. But it looks pretty positive. I'm definitely going to talk about this in the upcoming standards, not in person, but our virtual standards meetings that we're going to have coming up in the fall.
All right, Cassandra had a high-level question that maybe Kristján or Westbrook might take a crack at.
Biggest challenge you had in your respective approaches? What hurdles did you overcome in an interesting way? That is a great question. I think for us, the issue is like, we want to keep things really, really simple. And we want to be able to kind of, if this approach doesn't work out, we want to be able to like eject out of this experiment that we're doing. What we really liked about using TypeScript decorators is that you could just delete them and then include those functions just directly into your component. Like you could just write a code mod that would just go find all those decorators, and you could have the equivalent little code block and just inject that into the component, and you would be fully ejected. And that is kind of what we try to aim for. And I think it's like once you realize that, like that's kind of like the hurdle of like trying to be really simple. For us, we just landed on this like great technology that works really well for this use case, which is TypeScript decorators. Like you'll eject and like you'll have a really clean diff of like what changed, and it becomes really simple to like review. I guess I don't know if that answers the question, but I think that's the escape hatch exactly.
I'd love to add a little color there that I'm also working a lot with the people who are trying to advance the TC39 decorators proposal. And I am, call me an optimist, but I am optimistic that kind of fourth time is the charm on the decorators proposal, and that we have something that'll, it's a very, very constrained design space when talking about like the requirements from VMs and compilers and users and all that. But I think we finally found something that might be able to thread the needle there and let us get decorators in standard JavaScript.
That would be amazing.
Here's another very specific question for Kristján about bundling.
I missed the beginning, but how do you build and serve a minimum bundle with only custom element X and Y used on a page? I'm not sure I understand the question. How do you build?
I think the question was whether you're doing anything to prevent custom element definitions from being sent down that may not be used on the page that's being requested, or are you somehow sending down just custom element definitions that you know are used on a given page?
Currently, we are sending all custom element definitions to every page. Like, kind of going to the point earlier where we just want people to write HTML, kind of, where they should just be available. Like, they should be kind of like reusable components. And so if you need like a tab container or like an auto check element or whatever you're doing, you should just be able to write that HTML without having to worry to include that JavaScript. It's kind of like our thinking now, but you know, this thinking keeps evolving. And so as we have more custom elements, we might start splitting it down somehow, but that's just not a problem we have currently.
Here's a good one, not just for web components users, but anyone who's building UI stuff on the web. I'm sure we have some opinions and thoughts.
We need help here.
We need help.
I mean, it's not just web components. Like this is a big.
It's a platform issue.
Yeah. Let's repeat the questions for people maybe who can't read it visually. But so Ben is asking here about people's thoughts on overlays or pop-up behaviors with web components, and this is referring to things like drop-down menus and dialogues and tooltips and toasts and stuff like that need to appear above everything else in the page. And yeah, this is not something that's easy to do in web development at all today.
Yeah, so and I think that, he says hoisting is not a great solution. And just to be clear, that is generally the technique of saying, I'm going to move this, pop-up wherever it is to the body so that it appears on top of everything. And when you do that, it's at a different spot in the tree than maybe it was defined. The event propagation may change, the styling may change. You need a bunch of protocols for that. It basically sucks. And by the way, since way back when the Polymer project started, this was on our radar as one of the core problems to solve. And it's just been really hard to get the right primitive added to the platform. We've talked about it with platform engineers a number of times. It's just a tough one. And yeah, I mean, I think where we are right now is the state of the art is hoisting, and it basically sucks. And hopefully we can do better someday soon.
Yeah, I was actually encouraged a little bit by the recent progress on the imperative distribution API, being able to have code that determines what slot a child goes into. And it doesn't work for the pop-up case yet, but and I'm not a platform engineer, so I don't know like what terrible cases might be this might introduce into the platform. But I have this dream of being able to have an API where you can essentially take a slot, and instead of distributing it down into your subtree, you distribute it. Like hoisting is baked into the platform, and you can kind of distribute it up to some element that is able to take along the styles and event propagation with it. I don't know. We'll see. We'll have to ask our friends who work on the engines for this.
All right, so this question is really not, again, specific to web components, but I know that at least some of the panelists have some experience here. With so many techniques available for modern web today, how do we test performance for them? Is anyone automating it across browsers?
So with Spectrum Web Components, we're definitely leveraging the tachometer library that the Polymer team has vended, and always looking to find ways to expand that, because it isn't easy. It isn't always as reliable or as fruitful as you'd hope. And I've heard some great great new Hawtness brewing in that area. Is that true?
Are you asking us?
Yeah, yes, I am asking you, Dustin.
Yeah, so Al on our team who works on this has definitely added some really great new features to this recently. Also trying to help us with our lit HTML 2.0 work. So tachometer, for those who don't know, and Gray, I added a link to the YouTube comments, so maybe you can put that on screen there. But tachometer is a library that we wrote to help test our own other libraries to benchmark it. And it works a little bit like a unit test runner in that it can run these benchmarks in different browsers and tabs. It uses WebDriver also. It can even run them on mobile phones. And the interesting thing about tachometer is that it takes a statistical approach to benchmarking. So it will run like multiple benchmarks many times until it can be confident that, say, one is faster than another. And this is a way to kind of, even detect small performance differences in approaches. And then recently we've added support for being able to do like multiple measurements so that you can see where time is spent in different parts of your code, and to be able to export everything as these big CSV file dumps so that you can run your own statistical analysis on them. So this is something we continue to work on. I think the Preact team has recently started using this to measure their performance there. So we definitely encourage people to check it out. I mean, one thing it doesn't do, it would be really awesome, I think, if there was like maybe something that like wrapped tachometer to say like, oh, here's a component and we're just going to automate like a basic test for you to make sure that this component stays like lightweight over time. Something that's really easy to use.
Yeah, I was going to mention you do have to do that kind of yourself manually right now, but for the lit repos, one thing we've done is integrated it with our CI so that we basically can, do a PR to the Git repo and get a sense of how that's going to impact performance. And that can be helpful for, again, making sure that you're not slowing your code down over time.
All right, here's kind of an interesting ecosystem question that anyone on the panel might have an opinion on. So do we think there are too many small libraries, tools, and frameworks? And you can think about this more broadly about the front-end ecosystem, or we can think about it specifically in terms of web components, which is actually interesting. Like if you go to webcomponents.dev, there are now, the latest article, there was something like 34 ways to make a web component. And from my perspective, at the stage where we are the web components, the more the better. We're exploring patterns, but I'm curious to hear what other people think.
I mean, you may get a little bit of a biased answer here because of our interests, but I mean, are there too many frameworks? I would say, I mean, it's great to see that innovation. Of course, the big downside with frameworks is you're kind of siloed and it's hard, it would be kind of nuts to say, I'm going to use React and Vue and Angular all together on the same page. While it might be possible, it wouldn't be very practical. However, using web components authored in a bunch of different libraries that are, especially libraries that are doing really as best they can on performance and code size is pretty feasible. And that's one of the main value propositions of web components is they basically work everywhere. And one of the core visions really is that, people could make new elements, and the idea is the cream will rise to the top over time, and the community gets the best that it can get. It's taken a lot longer for that to be realized than we had hoped, but I think the vision is still there.
Yeah, we definitely are looking at that same sort of solution space with the modern-web.dev. That I mentioned, the new project from the Open Web Components team, and that it's really scary to a non-front end or a new front end, or even myself sometimes when I get out of my little bit of like horse blinders to see the number of tools and the number of options that are available to develop in our space. And it's really important, I think, to whether it's find ways to help the cream get to the top or realize ways that maybe you can do the same quality and type of development and maybe not rely on those tools, and maybe realize that things like modules are in the browser or things like component models are in the browser, so that you can maybe shorten that list of things that you need to know is really important.
right?
Yeah, I mean, this question, yes.
Go ahead, Justin.
Oh, you want to go? Okay. All right, okay. This question kind of speaks directly to the kind of thing I'll get up on a soapbox about, like at any opportunity. But
That's
you know,
almost anything, Justin.
this is true. But you know, I've been doing a lot of kind of interaction with people and thinking recently how to distill these points down to get across, you know, why we work on the things we do, why we care about this. And I think this kind of goes to the heart of it, in that like what we're trying to do with web components, I think is kind of like a microcosm, an example of something that applies all over the place. And specifically with frameworks, you know, we're trying to basically increase interoperability, increase encapsulation, and reduce costs of these things, so that the implications of having many choices doesn't matter as much. You can see this in design systems too. So we have a lot of design systems being built in web components right now. So Westbrook works on the Adobe Spectrum, which is built with lit element. One that got a lot of press recently was Shoelace, that is built with Stencil. And we have, I think, Red Hat's Patternfly library, shout out to Cassandra, I think uses their own system to build the design system with. And the great thing about this is that the interop and encapsulation allows these systems to be built and the users to not care how they were built, right? They don't care what framework it was built with, and the libraries are small enough that the cost isn't high. And so that way you can have, you know, lots of libraries, and it doesn't actually impact people and make that, you know, a negative. And then, like Steve said, like over time, the best patterns and libraries can be kind of discovered, and we'll have some reconsolidation.
All right, here's another one of those top questions. Theming, Shadow DOM. So probably the biggest hurdle in my project to adapt with lit element is using global theming with SCSS and with Shadow DOM. Any ideas to overcome this without turning off Shadow DOM?
So that's, yeah, it's kind of a very broad question, and it's hard to give like a specific answer, but I think we can say that in general, I think as you guys listening probably know, because you've been probably users of web components for a long time, or at least a while, we've gone through a lot of fits and starts on how you should do styling with Shadow DOM. Obviously, a lot of you know about Apply, which very sadly did not get adopted as a spec and now haunts us a bit. Custom properties are, of course, the fundamental kind of core primitive that's pretty, you know, supported in all major browsers now and works really great for theming, for targeted theming. And there's a lot of ways to skin the cat, especially when you use a tool like lit element and you're willing to kind of have your API go through lit element. It's something that we are exploring, potentially kind of showing additional patterns for. It's harder to do in a way that is, you know, platform supported. Of course, there is the part and theme spec that is now shipped. Part is actually shipped, I think, in Firefox and Chrome and
browsers,
and Safari now. Yeah.
And Safari.
And you know, I mean, in general, when we think about theming, we kind of have three use cases in mind. There's sort of like, I want to theme everything on my page a certain way. I want to theme like one thing, you know, one button a certain way, or I want to do theming that's sort of based on a subtree. And it's that last use case that's actually the trickiest and needs the most platform support to do in a way that is, you know, actually going to work ergonomically for users of CSS. The status of theme, I don't know, do you know off the top of your head, Justin?
Yeah, I mean, it's still kind of out there as like a follow-on to the : part proposal. But, you know, as the Polymer team has worked more and more closely with the material team and with more design system builders, I think that we've kind of come around on the idea that, you know, theme being similar to part, which kind of gives you the ability to like entirely style an element or some group of elements, isn't necessarily what you want for design systems. Design systems really want a way to express their design tokens, their customizability, the knobs, in the semantics of the design system itself. So for example, material has like elevation. And elevation has a few valid values, and they end up affecting a number of different CSS properties like background color, maybe border, drop shadow, things like that. And so theme wouldn't necessarily give you that, right? Like you might be able to select the element that has the drop shadow on it, but you would be unconstrained at that point and wouldn't necessarily be able to make sure that you're applying the design system correct values for that drop shadow. So I think at this point, what we would really like to see is more ability to build abstractions in CSS, to be able to build custom calculations and do lookup tables and this kind of stuff, maybe mix-ins, so that the design system could accept CSS custom variables that are design token values that then get applied to every place they need to have an effect. In my mind, a lot of what this is kind of thinking about bringing some of the power of SaaS directly into the platform. And I think that would help the situation a whole lot. Another thing I wanted to point out about theming too is I think that CSS is going to have to kind of go through a modularization revolution like JavaScript has. CSS modules, native CSS modules is something that's coming up soon, I hope. And that's going to help components import into their shadow root just the styles that they need and to share those among many components. And I think that right now CSS tends to be written in really big style sheets like Tailwind and Bootstrap. And if instead those are broken down into small modules, then you can share styles amongst your components by importing the parts you need for those components. And that alone will have a big positive impact, I think.
All right, I think we're going to wrap up in just a minute or two here. Let's put this question up. And so here's a question about, for people who are distributing web components, how do you bundle dependencies with web components for userland, especially when the dependencies are not ES module compliant?
Well, if your dependencies are not ES module compliant, the first thing that you should do is submit an issue to their repo. Everyone should be ES module compliant, and I definitely have heard news that recently major libraries have not done this. So be sure that you're making these issues and having your friends thumbs up them, because that's a huge issue, not just for web components, but for anyone that's going to be bundling those code. But when you are working in this context, I would definitely check out some of the roll-up plugin opportunities that Open Web Components delivers, and that there are specific plugins and configurations for you to be able to ensure that those non-ES module dependencies are converted and included as best they can by the bundler systems that are available today. But definitely a very sticky situation there.
All right, and we have more questions coming in, but I think we're going to wrap it up. We're at about an hour and a half. So I'm going to go ahead and put up this last slide, which has, one second, I'm also going to try and get rid of my Q&A banner. Put up this last slide, which has a bunch of links. First of all, we'd love to get your feedback on what worked well and what didn't. This is our first crack at a virtual meetup, so any constructive feedback would be awesome. If you have ideas about either a talk that you would like to give or you'd like to see someone else give, that's what that second form is all about at a future meetup. And then, as we said, we want to take the conversation. If you're interested in continuing to talk with the folks you've been talking with on the live stream, we've created a channel called WCSF inside the Polymer Slack, and the Polymer Slack is a little bit misleadingly named at this point because there's all kinds of interesting discussions about all things web components there. So you might be interested in that even if you didn't have more questions for today. So links and QR codes for both joining the Slack and for getting to the channel. And I just want to say a big thank you to our speakers, Westbrook and Kristján. Kristján, a special thanks to you for staying up late into your evening to present, and of course thanks to Justin and Steve for joining us on the panel too. So until next time, thanks, and we'll see you out in Web Components land.
Thanks everyone.
Thank you.